So last time we talked about the political status of the Filipinos immediately after U.S. takeover of the Philippines. And this was done through the Treaty of Paris. And after several years of war, known as the Filipino-American War, U.S. was finally able to take possession of the Philippines. In 1904, in order to determine the political status of the Filipinos, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the Gonzales versus United States case, rendered a decision that Filipinos would be considered as U.S. nationals. And they became a ward of the United States, which meant that they came under the care of the United States, militarily, economically, politically, and otherwise. They owed their allegiance to the United States. Their rights were of a partial citizenship, except for voting, and also running for political offices were not permitted. But they were not completely aliens and subjected to the exclusionary immigration laws. But they could serve in the US Armed Forces. So as you can imagine, the US national status occupied this in-between status between aliens, immigrants, and US citizens. And there were certain advantages of having this kind of US national status. And the most important, perhaps, advantage was their ability to immigrate into the United States. But the political context of their immigration to the United States is worth discussing in a little bit of greater detail. Here is a newspaper article that was published during this time period in the 1920s, 1930s. And they were discussing the political circumstances that impacted not just the Filipinos, but also other Asians and Mexican immigrants. So let's take a look at the content of this article, see what was going on during this time period. So the article reads, at the time of the passage of the Japanese Exclusion Act of 1924, they're referring to the Immigration Act of 1924. The farm industrialists intended to use Mexican labor, right? So after excluding the Japanese, the farmers who needed to bring in labor, they wanted to bring in Mexican workers. But Mexican labor had been recruited in ever increasing volume since 1914, since World War I, because there was a labor shortage in the United States. It was cheap, plentiful, and docile. But suddenly the Box Bill and the Harris Bill, the Box and Harris Bill is known as the Immigration Act of 1924, threatened the supply. It was at this point that the farmers beckoned to the Filipino. In fact, the first marked increase in the number of Filipinos entering continental United States occurred in 1923 in anticipation of the Exclusion Act. In 1923, 2,426 Filipinos entered California, whereas in the 3 preceding years, the average annual number of arrivals had been only 618. So there was a sharp spike in the number of Filipino immigration to the United States in 1923 in anticipation of the exclusion law that was going to be passed in 1924. During the years between 1923 to 1929, the average annual number of Filipinos entering the United States was 4,177. Figures compiled by the state of California in an official report of 1930 indicate that there were about 34,000 Filipinos in the state at that time. The purpose for which this supply of cheap Filipino labor was recruited is conceded. The Commonwealth Club of California, on November 5th, 1929, issued a report on Filipino immigration in which it was stated that threat of Mexican exclusion has created an artificial demand for Filipino laborers. They are regarded as the only remaining substitute in the cheap labor field. The large agricultural interests are acting as a conduit, transmitting numbers of such immigrants. Okay, I'm going to stop here and then let us think about that newspaper article and the political circumstances regarding the decision to allow the Filipino laborers in agriculture in particular to enter the United States. Why is this significant in your mind? So we begin with the Chinese immigration to the United States, and we needed them to work on so many different areas, including the agriculture, including the railroads, manufacturing, the fisheries. And then we would pass an exclusion law. And then we bring in another batch of laborers from Japan. And they do the same thing, right? They become very successful in agriculture, yet again, pass another law to exclude the Japanese. And then we allow Koreans and Asian Indians. The same pattern repeats itself. In the 1920s, beginning of 1914, beginning of World War One, recognizing the shortage of labor in agriculture, we would bring in Mexican labor. And then on the eve of the 1924 Immigration Act that would potentially exclude Mexican immigration to the United States, we would replace Mexican labor with Filipino labor. And then we find out in 1934, Filipinos once again would be excluded from coming into the United States. So the pattern is undeniable here from the 19th century well into the 20th century. And the pattern, guess what, continues to this day. I'm kind of curious as to what the takeaway is for you analytically. How do you make sense of this? What is the significance in light of American history that demonstrates this troubling sort of pattern of bringing people in and then eventually excluding them and then bringing another batch of labor from another country into the United States? And the pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. What can we learn from this history?
I think, just from my perspective, a lot of the exclusion is fueled by the fear of a different demographic of people settling in the United States and taking what is rightfully supposed to be for Americans. And the idea of being American is, highly racialized and nationalist. So the way that I see it is like, we need labor, so we're going to take cheap labor. White people can't do that labor because they have higher standards of living. So we're going to take this cheap labor, but then once this population starts to actually settle and build its own community, then that's threatening. So we're going to exclude them. So then we move on to the next one, and it's just a continuing cycle. And actually, what got me the most about article that you just read us about the Mexican exclusion prompts Filipino immigration is that at the last part it said that Filipinos were the last source of cheap labor. So the United States had gone through this cycle so much to the point that the United States at that point believed that they were on the last stop, I guess.
Well, guess what? It wasn't the last stop because they would turn once again to the Mexican labor. So what ended up happening was that in 1924, people were kind of concerned about the exclusion of Mexican labor into the United States. But it did not completely exclude the Mexicans into the United States. And in 1935, the United States passes a law known as the Repatriation Act that sought to return all of these Mexican laborers back to Mexico. And we had a similar process for the Filipinos, where we said, okay, Filipinos who are working in the United States, we will pay for your passage back to the Philippines under the condition that you will promise never to return to the United States. This was 1935, around the time when we passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act. And we had caravans and we had railroad cars that were lined up from Los Angeles, for instance, to the border town of Mexico, US-Mexico border. We would put them on these trains and then send back Mexicans back to Mexico. When World War II breaks out in 1941 for the United States, most of the men who were eligible for draft had to go and fight in the war, which created a major labor shortage, particularly in agriculture. So what do? we initiated what is known as the Bracero program that began in 1942, and it would outlive the war. The war ends in 1945. It was a wartime emergency measure to bring Mexican agricultural labor into the United States, right? That started in 1942, but it does not end until 1964, 19 years after the war had ended. So what this demonstrated was there was such a dependence on foreign labor in America's agriculture, historically speaking, right? We needed people to come and work in America's agriculture because it's a backbreaking work. I mean, if you ever worked in California's fruit and vegetable industry, thinning beets or picking strawberries or things like that, it is a asparagus. It is a backbreaking work. So structurally speaking, in America's agriculture historically, we depended on foreign labor who were willing to work in these kinds of difficult and challenging occupations. After 1964, the US continues to provide temporary visas, right? It's called H-2A visas to temporary agricultural workers. And this is, still in existence in the year 2020. And we had relied on so many different types of ethnic populations to work, particularly in US Southwest agriculture. An important sort of theme here is that this pattern of bringing foreign labor into the United States and then excluding them demonstrates very powerfully contradictory sort of forces that have always been in existence. On the one hand, we have this persistent labor need in particular sectors within the United States. It used to be agriculture, but it has now spread to restaurant and hotel and other kinds of businesses. At the same time, there has always been sort of racial animus toward those populations. The majority of the American population does not want these socially undesirable populations to reproduce in the United States and become thick in American society. And so the pressure mounts, especially in times of economic downturn, to exclude those populations because of the perception they are extracting resources, scarce resources from the United States without recognizing the fact that they are providing critical labor and services to sectors that depend on such a labor. And so, we have to then deal with this contradiction: economic structural dependence for foreign labor and impetus on the part of the mainstream American society to deny social reproduction of foreign nationalities in the United States, or nationalities that are perceived as foreign in the United States. And this contradiction hasn't gone away.
I was just gonna say, like, I think it's very telling, and like to point out that it's still going on today because remember, I don't know, maybe it was a few years ago, people making a really big deal about the fact that it was like the first year that like the minority birth rate was higher than that of like the white birth rate or something like that, and that was like a big deal to some people. And that's even in like some of the political climate right now, what's being talked about. So that's still like an American concern.
Well, it's an interesting dilemma because the issue is not just pertinent to the United States, but many other so-called developed countries where there's drastic sort of reduction of birth rate. So many of the countries in Europe, for instance, Germany, Sweden, you name it, all of the Western European countries are experiencing immigration influx because there is a shortage of workers in those countries because the Germans did not reproduce enough. The birth rate is less than 1%, less than one per household. And it created a severe labor shortage over time. So what did they do? They decided to initiate what is known as the guest worker program, right? Bringing in people from Turkey and now some African countries, and also from Spain and Italy as well. And generally speaking, these immigrant populations will reproduce more children, thereby helping the economy. I mean, they're the future labor force of those countries. So immigration policy goes hand in hand with some of these countries' effort to deal with labor shortage because of the declining birth rate. The United States would have experienced the same dilemma. Modern men and women don't want to have babies right away. And even if they do, maybe they'll have just one, right? It really depends on, I mean, there are religious sort of factors too, but generally speaking. And this creates a huge dilemma for the country because you need to reproduce more in order to provide labor force sufficient enough to sustain the economy, to help pay for social security, for instance, for the elderly population, but for others as well. Well, all of the social welfare benefits, things like that are taxed from all of the populations. Well, we need workers. We're not going to have workers unless we have more children. And generally speaking, immigrant families tend to have higher rate of birth versus the people who are members of the host country, right? And this is a worldwide issue. It's an issue in Europe. It's issue in Asia as well, in countries like Japan, Korea, Singapore. Let me go back to the slides once again, and then let me go through a few more. So I think I mentioned this in 1918. The United States Congress passes a law that would allow a native-born Filipino or Puerto Rican who has enlisted or may hereafter enlist in the U.S. Navy or Marine Corps or the Naval Auxiliary Service. Any alien serving in the military or naval service of the United States during the time this country is engaged in the present war, provided he appears with his two eyewitnesses. What that law allowed was for the Filipinos and Puerto Ricans to become naturalized citizens of the United States. Filipino immigration to the United States as a consequence of the Filipinos becoming US nationals, they were able to enter both Hawaii and the mainland in large numbers. So as early as 1907, for instance, the same year that we had passed the Gentleman's Agreement, the Japanese Exclusion Act, 150 Filipinos arrived in Hawaii. 2 years later, the number increased to 639. In 1910, only 3 years after, there were 2,915. During the decade of 1911 to 1920, there were about 3,000 workers arrived annually from the Philippines, right? So as you can see, there was a significant sort of incline in terms of the Filipino immigration to the United States. In 1919, there were about 25,000 Japanese and about 10,000 Filipinos, representing 55% to 23% respectively. And this ratio would flip shortly thereafter. The 1920s saw an average of 7,630 Filipinos arriving in Hawaii annually. And this would, once again, completely change the demographics of laborers in Hawaii. So by 1932, Filipino Americans would dominate the labor force of Hawaii, surpassing the number of Japanese Americans. By the 1930s, Filipinos had populated the West Coast, the mainland United States, and made their way up to Seattle, Washington, and also to Alaska's Cannery Row as well. 1933, the Cannery Workers and Farm Laborers Union was formed in Seattle, composed largely of the Filipino workers. And also in Alaska, the fishing and cannery business were supported by the Filipino labor during that time period. Here is a poem that talks about how difficult it was for many of the Filipino men to work in these kinds of fields, both in agriculture and fisheries and canneries. So, as you can see here, I can imagine what day to day sort of life must have been like for people from the Philippines to be working in these kinds of conditions in the cannery of Alaska. Filipinos in California would play a very prominent role in developing the agribusiness industry of the state of California, right? So California's diversified agricultural production grew more than 300 commodities and made farming a lucrative industry for the state's agribusiness elite, right? And they were composed of minority populations such as the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Asian Indians, Filipinos, and Mexicans. It was truly a diverse agricultural workforce during this time period in California. And the California's Filipino population grew. You know, there were only 5 in 1900 to 30,000 by 1930. And when Filipino workers made up nearly 15% of all California's agricultural workers. So there was a significant jump Filipino workers by 1930. There were numerous challenges, obviously, Filipinos experience in a similar way as other ethnic minorities faced prior to Filipinos coming to California. And their difficulties were well captured by a novelist by the name of Carlos Bolasan. He wrote a book titled America is in the Heart, where he talks about the migration experiences and the adaptation of many Filipino Americans in the United States. And there was a passage that really struck a chord with me, and I wanted to share that with you today. So he writes on page 121, I came to know afterward that in many ways it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. I came to know that the public streets were not free to my people. We were stopped each time these vigilant patrolmen saw us driving a car. We were suspect each time we were seen with a white woman. And perhaps it was this narrowing of our life into an island, into a filthy segment of American society that had driven Filipinos like Doro inward, hating everyone and despising all positive urgencies toward freedom. And what is he saying from that passage? How did it kind of resonate with you?
I think it's super recognizable to me. It's just this moment of disillusionment that a lot of immigrants come to terms with. It's definitely a moment in a lot of immigrants' lives where they realize, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, I think it's pretty powerful for someone to be able to say that came to know later that it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. Your ethnicity is a crime in that state. And this, narrowing of life, right? They came to the United States in order to expand opportunities, in order to fulfill those dreams of becoming free, of becoming independent financially. And yet, upon reflection, right, the author is saying it was a crime to be a Filipino in California. There's a narrowing of life. Driving while Filipino was pervasive during that time period. And people were suspect every time you were dating somebody out of your race. And other opportunities that they thought were plentiful in California actually did not turn out to be so. So there was a huge disappointment and difficulty that many of the Filipinos experienced trying to make ends meet and perhaps to save some money and return home one day. But a lot of their hopes and aspirations were dashed because they were treated as though they were criminals. So I thought that was a really powerful statement. And that kind of experience, I think, can be relatable to other ethnic and racial populations, even to this day. I mean, the entire Black Lives Matter movement rests on this notion that you're perceived as a criminal because of the color of your skin. And Carlos Bulloson was saying the same thing about the Filipinos. It was a crime to be Filipino in California. It was a crime to be a black and brown person driving, right, in various parts of the United States. So it's a really troublesome kind of reflection, but one that I think accurately portrays the difficulties that many of the Filipinos during that time period experienced. And, there were reasons as to why Carlos Boasan commented that it was a crime to be a Filipino in the state of California. If you would take a look at the marriage laws of that time period, the state of California had passed what is known as the anti-miscegenation law, which prohibited marriages between white persons and Negroes, Mongolians, and mulattoes. Right? There was no mention of Malay race. So in 1931, in Roldan v. Los Angeles County, it was declared that a Filipino was not a Mongolian, but it quickly added the phrase or member of the Malay race of which Filipinos belonged, right? So the new law in the state of California stated that these individuals of races and persons of Malay race, of which Filipinos are part, were prohibited from intermarrying with Caucasian persons. They also lived in segregated communities, right? This was during the time period of Jim Crow laws after 1896, as you know, in the Plessy versus Ferguson case. The separate but equal doctrine created separate accommodations, including housing, for certain races, particularly African Americans, but this also applied to Filipinos as well. The Filipino American community was similar to the Chinese American community in that there was a heavy male sort of presence. And there was a political segregation of Filipinos because they were not able to vote as a naturalized citizens of the United States unless you participated or joined US naval forces. There was economic segregation. By that, we mean Filipinos were relegated to low-paid menial labor in agriculture and cannery. They were unable to own land, and there were limited educational opportunities for them to kind of move up the social ladder. Social segregation also meant that they lived in segregated communities. They lived in old shacks devoid of basic utilities, and they were unable to intermarry outside of their ethnicity. Well, what ended up happening to the Filipinos eventually was that they too experienced a form of immigration exclusion that was perhaps a little bit different than some other populations. As I mentioned previously, in 1934, the US Congress passed what is known as the Tidings-McDuffie Act. And this act was an effort to stem the tide of Filipino immigration to the United States. But because Filipinos were a ward of the United States as US nationals, we could not legally prohibit their immigration to the United States. The only way in which we could do so was to change their political status from US nationals to aliens. One way in which we could change their political status to aliens is to provide their nation with independence, to establish the Commonwealth of the Philippines, which at the end of a 10-year transition period would become the fully independent Republic of the Philippines, right? So 10 years from the passage of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, the Philippines was promised fully independent Republic of the Philippines, severing ties with US colonial master. A plebiscite on the Constitution for the new republic was approved in 1935, and the date for national independence was set for July 4th, 1946. Ironic, is it not, right? So the Independence Day for the Filipinos from the United States would be the same day as the America's Independence Day, but in 1946. So it happened precisely 12 years after the passage of the Tidings-McDuffie Act. The impact on the Filipinos was quite obvious. They were no longer considered US nationals. and became subject to the restriction limitations of the existing immigration laws of the time period. Here's another article about the debates regarding the Filipino exclusion and immigration. So here's another article that talks about HR 6464. HR refers to House resolution. So this is a lower house of the US Congress, which passed a resolution 6464. It was a measure to provide free transportation to the Philippine Islands for Filipinos residing in the United States. The publicity which the measure received did not, however, make mention of Section 4 of the Act, which stated that no Filipino who receives the benefits of this Act shall be entitled to return to the continental United States, right? This is amazing, right? Something that I mentioned earlier. In other words, the bill is in effect an exclusion act. For no Filipino who takes advantage of the act can re-enter the continental United States except within the quota established in the Philippine Island Independence Act of March 1934, which is tantamount to permanent exclusion. It is impossible to understand the motivation back of the transportation measure without having in mind the real story of the Filipino in the United States, which is to say the Filipino in California. So what do you think about that resolution?
I think it's similar to what we attempted to do with African Americans once they were freed. I see similarities between trying to send Africans back to Africa and between sending Filipinos back to the Philippines. And I think that it's really interesting that we didn't just stop at exclusion, that we felt the need not only to exclude these people, but also to send them back, quote unquote, to like where they belong or where they came from.
Do you mean back to Liberia? Is that what you're referencing?
Yes, yeah.
There are some similarities, but there are some important differences too, right? Because you had people like Marcus Garvey, right, who attempted to, I guess, galvanize African Americans living in the United States to go back to Africa. So there was an effort on the part of the US government to do so, but also even among African Americans who thought that, you know, because US was so racist against African Americans, we should all go back, right? So it was an effort on the part of both the US government and also some segments of the African American community. The House Resolution 6464 was entirely US government's effort to repatriate Filipinos back to the Philippines without mentioning, you know, the key provision which stated that, you know, if you take advantage of this free travel back to the Philippines, you are no longer permitted to re-enter the United States. How many Filipinos do you think took advantage of this free passage back to the Philippines? Do you think that a lot of people took advantage of it? Give it a guess.
Probably not.
Yeah, they did not. They saw right through this scheme. They said, "Are you kidding me? You're gonna send me back? Okay, you're gonna pay for my passage, but you're not gonna allow me to re-enter the United States. That is not gonna happen." So it was an attempt by the U.S. government which failed, right? But what is important here is the, you know, motivation behind it, right? The effort on the part of the U.S. government to return Filipinos back to the Philippines after having extracted, you know, the labor from young, particularly, you know, male Filipinos working on agriculture canneries in California to Alaska, right? All right, so let me move on. This is an article that talks about how on the eve of the passage of the 1924 Immigration Act, people thought that this was going to exclude the Mexicans, but it turned out to be a false alarm. and Mexicans were not completely excluded from entering the United States, which meant that we didn't need as many sort of Filipinos in agriculture. So that's a part of the reason why we wanted to reverse the course for the Filipino Americans by passing HR 6464. So there was an intimate sort of relationship between Mexicans and Filipinos working in California's agriculture. Here's an article that talks about the Filipino Labor Union, or FLU, strikes that were conducted in 1934. This was a very sort of fascinating strike, and it would set the precedent for later strikes that were to follow, not just among the Filipinos, but in solidarity with Mexican agriculture workers as well. It reads, the Filipino militantly race conscious began to protest against his exploitation in California at an early date and has grown increasingly rebellious. The Filipino Labor Union, restricted to agricultural workers, has 7 locals with a membership of about 2,000 in California today. The Filipinos is a real fighter, and his strikes have been dangerous. In August 1934, about 3,000 Filipino workers went on strike in the valuable lettuce fields near Salinas, California. On September 3, a union of white workers employed in the packing sheds returned to work under an agreement to arbitrate. In fact, they were told to return to work by Joseph Casey, AFL official. But the Filipino field workers refused to call off the strike. State highway patrolmen were summoned, and aided by special deputies and a local vigilante group, they formed a small army which went the round of the lettuce fields, suggesting to idle Filipino field hands that they move. Approximately 700 Filipinos among those who refused to return to work were driven out of the Salinas fields by force. The camp of Rufo Canete, a popular Filipino labor contractor, was raided by vigilantes and burned to the ground at a loss of Canete of approximately $16,000. Many Filipinos were corralled and held incommunicado, and of course, the strike was broken. Fascinating, right? The Filipino labor union members were becoming racially conscious. They were becoming much more militant in terms of trying to secure their rights as workers. And there were efforts on the part of the, I guess, the people who owned many of these farms to break the backs of their strikes. It is entirely sort of fascinating history to learn about the activism of the Filipino farm workers in the state of California as early as the 1920s and 1930s. And that would set the stage for major strikes that would happen in solidarity with Mexican workers well into the 1950s and 1960s. So this is a kind of history that we never learn about. I mean, this is an amazing part of labor history in the state of California, right? Despite the hardships that they experienced, they were able to overcome ethnic differences with Mexican workers. They were able to bond together and work in solidarity in order to sort of resist against the kinds of oppressive work environment that they had to endure during this time period. Okay, maybe one more slide and then we'll call it a day. Okay, it goes on, the repatriation scheme. Okay, the Filipino labor unions. So the Filipinos comprise nearly the entire asparagus picking workforce in the Sacramento and San Joaquin valleys and handled over 80% of the Salinas Valley lettuce crop. 80% of the lettuce of Salinas Valley. And of course, these lettuce would make their way to all the way to East Coast. So they were feeding, right, the rest of America with the hands of the Filipino workers, right? 1933, Rufo Canete and other Filipino labor leaders met in Salinas and formed the Filipino Labor Union, and they grew in terms of the number of chapters and also in terms of the sheer membership. 1938, Filipino American Labor Association formed and changed the name to Federated Agricultural Laborers Association, otherwise known as FALA, which would play a very prominent role in working together with Mexican Farm Workers Union in the later decades, right? So these are some of the photographs of the Filipinos in their places of work. This is their sort of dormitory, I guess, where they slept, the bunk beds, no, I mean, some of the shacks in which they lived. And this is a very sort of popular hangout place for a lot of the Filipino men. On their off days, they would sort of hit the town, so to speak, and gather in places like Luzon Cafe and pool halls, and also dance halls, which would create all kinds of reaction by particularly white men who were living in California at the time, right? The friction was over Filipinos dancing or courting white women. In terms of the ratio between white men to women, the ratio was 1 to 16, not too dissimilar from the Chinese men in the state of California. And so a lot of the Filipino men decided to intermarry with a Mexican woman because there was a shortage of Filipinas. And yeah, I mentioned, I think on Tuesday, how there was a film depicting the life of Filipino laborers frequenting these dance halls where they would pay 10 cents a dance to dance with a Caucasian woman. So they would spend their earnings at dance halls where mostly Mexican and white women served as dance partners. Okay, I think I'm gonna stop here.